June 24, 1945. Red Square, Moscow. The war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered. 40,000 Soviet soldiers stood in formation as the cameras rolled and the crowds roared. The man who had accepted Germany's unconditional surrender rode into the square on a white horse. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the most decorated military commander in Soviet history. Stalin watched from the top of the Lenin mausoleum. 1 year later, almost to the day, Zhukov was gone. This is the story of Georgy Zhukov. The man Stalin needed too much to destroy, and what it cost to survive him. He was born on December 1, 1896, in the village of Strelkovka, a small settlement roughly 100 miles southwest of Moscow. His father was a shoemaker. His mother was a peasant laborer. There was no money for schooling beyond the first few grades. At 11 years old, he moved to Moscow and apprenticed as a furrier, making fur coats for Russians wealthier than his family would ever be. He worked 12-hour shifts. He slept on the floor of his workstation. Then, in 1915, the Imperial Army called him up. He served in the 10th Dragoon Novgorod Regiment. He was a cavalryman. He fought on the Eastern Front. He was wounded in action, decorated twice with the Cross of St. George, the highest award available to a non-commissioned officer, and promoted through the enlisted ranks on nothing but ability. In the old Russia, a man like Zhukov could never become an officer. His birth made that impossible. The revolution changed the calculation entirely. He joined the Bolsheviks, joined the Red Army, and fought in the Civil War. He was 22 years old, commanding cavalry, winning, and learning. The new Soviet system offered men like Zhukov something the old world never would, a straight line between ability and rank. He climbed it, steadily, without patrons, without connections, without anything except the results he produced. By the early 1930s, he was a divisional commander, competent, disciplined, not yet famous. One capable officer among many in a very large army. That was about to change. Not because of anything Zhukov did, but because of what Stalin was about to do to everyone around him. In 1937 and 1938, Stalin destroyed his own army. Marshal Tukhachevsky, the most gifted military theorist in the Soviet Union, was arrested, tortured, and shot. Hundreds of senior officers followed. By the time the purges ended, 3 of the 5 marshals of the Soviet Union were dead. 13 of 15 army commanders were dead. 50 of 57 corps commanders were dead. The Red Army that would face Hitler in 1941 had been gutted of its best minds before the war even began. Zhukov survived. He was not yet prominent enough to be threatening, and he was careful, neither too close to the men being arrested nor too vocal in their defense. He watched. He waited. He kept his head down and his performance high. Then, in the spring of 1939, everything changed. On June 1, 1939, Zhukov was summoned to Moscow. He later admitted that he assumed he was being arrested. Instead, he was handed an assignment on the remote border between Soviet Mongolia and Japanese of Manchuria. A conflict had begun over a few miles of featureless steppe. Japanese forces had attacked. The local Soviet commander was failing. Stalin wanted someone who could win. He sent Zhukov. Zhukov arrived to find the Soviet command in disarray. No telephone lines to the front. No supply chain. The enemy controlled the air. The operational railhead was over 400 miles behind the lines. He fixed it. He organized 4,000 trucks to haul supplies across the steppe. He assembled infantry, tanks, and aircraft. He trained them in secret at night to prevent Japanese reconnaissance from detecting the buildup. Then, on August 20, 1939, the same week that Ribbentrop flew to Moscow to sign the Nazi-Soviet pact, he launched a 3-pronged combined arms assault that the world had never seen before. He held the center with infantry to pin the Japanese in place. Then he sent his armor around both flanks simultaneously, encircling the entire Japanese force. In 10 days, it was over. Roughly 75% of the Japanese frontline troops were killed or captured. Japan's generals looked at what Zhukov had done and drew a conclusion that would shape the entire Pacific War. Do not fight Russia again. Zhukov was awarded the first of his 4 Hero of the Soviet Union medals. Stalin had found his general. Kulkin made Zhukov impossible to ignore. He was summoned back to Moscow, decorated, promoted. By January 1941, 18 months after his victory in Mongolia, he was chief of the General Staff of the Soviet Red Army. The furrier's apprentice from Stalkovka now sat at the top of the largest military force on Earth. He would need every bit of it. On June 22, 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Despite every warning from foreign intelligence, from his own generals, from Zhukov himself, who had argued in May for a preemptive strike, Stalin had refused to believe it was coming. The Red Army was caught flat-footed. In the first weeks, hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were captured. Entire armies ceased to exist. Stalin shut himself in his office and said nothing publicly for 11 days. Zhukov was one of the few men who went to Stalin directly during those days. He later recalled calling the Kremlin on the first morning of the invasion, reporting the situation, requesting permission to return fire. Stalin was silent. The only thing Zhukov could hear was the sound of his breathing. This was the man Zhukov served, a man who, when the catastrophe he had refused to prevent finally arrived, went silent. Zhukov did not go silent. He was already fighting. By October, German tanks were 20 miles from the Kremlin. Stalin ordered the government evacuated to the east. Many in Moscow believed the city was finished. Stalin asked Zhukov a direct question. Can Moscow be defended? Speak honestly as a communist. Zhukov said yes, but that he needed reserves he did not have. He named the number of divisions, the guns, the men. He told Stalin what was required, which almost no one around Stalin dared to do. Stalin's circle had learned that the price of delivering bad news could be a bullet. Zhukov delivered it anyway. Stalin gave him what he could. Zhukov made it work. On December 5th, Zhukov launched his counteroffensive. Siberian divisions, freed from the eastern border after intelligence confirmed Japan would not attack, charged forward through temperatures of -30 degrees Celsius. German soldiers in summer uniforms, their weapons frozen, had no answer for it. The Germans were pushed back up to 150 miles. It was the Wehrmacht's first major defeat of the war. Stalin, watching from Moscow, did not congratulate Zhukov. He called him in and told him to extend the offensive. Immediately, everywhere along the entire front, it was an order born of elation rather than strategy. Zhukov and his fellow commanders objected. The Soviet armies were exhausted. The momentum would be lost in overextension. Stalin overruled them. The expanded offensive stalled. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers died in the failed push that followed. Zhukov had been right. Stalin had been wrong. Both men knew it. Neither said so openly. This was the texture of their relationship throughout the war. Stalin needed Zhukov to win. He also needed to believe that the victories were his own, that he was the architect and Zhukov merely the instrument. Zhukov, who had grown up with nothing and climbed to the top of the Soviet military on nothing but ability, did not pretend well. He pushed back when he thought Stalin was wrong. He pressed for the resources he needed when they were withheld. He told the truth when the truth was unwelcome. It worked because the war demanded it. Stalin tolerated what in peacetime he would have punished, because he could not afford to lose the one man who kept winning. In November 1942, Zhukov and his colleague Vasilevsky designed the operation that would turn the entire war. Operation Uranus, a massive double encirclement that trapped the German 6th Army in Stalingrad. More than 250,000 men surrounded. Field Marshal Paulus surrendered in February 1943. In January 1943, Stalin promoted Zhukov to Marshal of the Soviet Union. He was the first field commander to receive the rank during the war. The war continued for 2 more years, vast, brutal, and eventually decisive. At every turning point, Zhukov was there, coordinating, commanding, fixing what others had broken. But something had begun to shift. As Soviet victory moved from possible to certain, Stalin's reliance on Zhukov began to look, to Stalin, less like strength and more like dependency. A man who had saved you once was useful. A man the whole country knew had saved you. Repeatedly, visibly, indisputably. was something else. By April 1945, Zhukov commanded the final assault on Berlin itself. 2.5 million men. More firepower concentrated in one place than any battle in history. On May 8, 1945, it was Georgy Zhukov who accepted Germany's unconditional surrender, not Stalin. Zhukov. Stalin was in Moscow. He came home the most famous man in the Soviet Union. Eisenhower called him a friend. Montgomery decorated him. The crowds adored him. This was the problem. In a state built on one man's absolute supremacy, a second man beloved by the army and the people was not an asset. He was a threat. Stalin moved carefully. He needed a pretext. He found one in the so-called aviators' affair, a purge of Soviet aviation officials in 1946. Under interrogation by the secret police, Air Marshal Alexander Novikov signed a statement accusing Zhukov of claiming personal credit for Soviet victories, of undermining Stalin's role, of fostering a personal faction in the military. Novikov later confessed he had signed the statement to make the interrogation stop. "They broke my morals," he said. "I was desperate, sleepless nights, so I signed it just to stop it. It did not matter. The pretext was enough." In June 1946, less than a year after leading the greatest victory parade in Soviet history, Zhukov was stripped of all his positions and sent to command the Odessa military district, a remote, strategically irrelevant posting for the man who had held Moscow-designed Stalingrad and accepted Berlin. His name began to disappear from official histories. Paintings of the victory parade were altered, his likeness removed. The man who had actually won the war was being erased from the account of it. In January 1948, it got worse. An investigation found trophies in his apartments, gold, furs, paintings, items he had taken from Germany. The investigation concluded he had looted. Zhukov admitted in writing to improper behavior and swore his loyalty to Stalin. He was demoted again, sent still further from Moscow to command the Ural military district in Sverdlovsk. He later wrote, in 1947, "I feared arrest every day. I had a bag ready with my underwear in it." The man who had saved Moscow feared he would be taken in the night like everyone else. He was not taken, but he was not forgiven either. He stayed in Sverdlovsk, remote and diminished, for 5 years. He waited. He had no other choice. Then, on March 5, 1953, the wait ended. Joseph Stalin was dead. The system built around one man's absolute authority immediately began to fracture. His successors needed the army. The army respected Zhukov more than any of them. He was brought back. On June 26, 1953, at a special meeting of the Politburo, Zhukov personally helped arrest Lavrentiy Beria, the secret police chief who had spent years feeding Stalin's suspicions of him. Beria was led away by soldiers Zhukov had quietly prepositioned outside the meeting room. He was tried and executed before the year was out. Zhukov later called it the most important thing he ever did. In 1955, Zhukov was made Minister of Defense. He implemented major reforms. He reduced the bloated officer corps. He pushed for military professionalism over political loyalty. He made enemies. In June 1957, when a coalition within the Politburo tried to remove Nikita Khrushchev, Zhukov organized military aircraft to fly Central Committee members from across the country to Moscow, shifting the political balance and saving Khrushchev's position. Khrushchev rewarded him with promotion to full membership in the Presidium. For months later, he removed him. On October 4, 1957, Zhukov left for an official state visit to Yugoslavia and Albania. He was away for 3 weeks. While he was gone, the meeting was organized. On October 26, his plane landed in Moscow. He was taken straight to a meeting of the Presidium and removed from his post before the day was out. The charges this time were that he was trying to make the army too independent of the Communist Party. He was sent into retirement. The pattern had repeated itself. Without Stalin, under a different man in a different era, the Soviet system still could not tolerate him. He spent the remaining years of his life writing his memoirs. He worked on them for almost a decade. When they were finally published in 1969, entire sections had been removed by censors. His criticism of Stalin's failures, his account of the purges, his honest assessment of what the war had cost. The book that appeared was not the one he wrote. He died on June 18, 1974, at the age of 77. He was buried in the Kremlin Wall, the most honored location in the Soviet state. He held 4 Hero of the Soviet Union medals. No one in Soviet history held more. There is a statue of him in Moscow now on a white horse on Mneznaya Square, just outside the Kremlin. The village boy from Strelkovka, who apprenticed as a furrier, who was told by birth that rank was not for him, cast in bronze outside the heart of the state that spent 20 years trying to diminish him. He held Moscow when it was within the Germans' grasp. He planned Stalingrad when the war hung in the balance. He accepted Berlin when it was finally over. And when it was done, the man he had served, the state he had saved, handed him a bag and told him to go to Odessa. That is what it meant to be the man Stalin needed too much to destroy.